It's my great pleasure to welcome you to Klangraum Krems Minoritenkirche. Welcome to the European Literature Days 2022. The philosopher Alenka Zupančič thinks about the comic to think about humanity. True comedy, she says, has got something subversive about it. I'm delighted to introduce you to Rosie Goldsmith, who is going to talk to Alenka now. Rosie is a British multimedia journalist specializing in arts, literature, and international affairs. She has worked for BBC Radio Worldwide and directs now the European Literature Network in London. Please, Rosie and Alenka.
Wonderful. It's great to be back, and thank you so much for having us, and welcome to Alenka. Now I'm going to put these down here, and I think it's really perfect that for a festival where we're going to be talking about comedy and crisis, that we actually have a philosopher of comedy with us to explain what's actually going on when we talk about comedy. So, but let me just tell you a little bit about Alenka before we start talking about the theory and the philosophy of comedy, because I really want you to know what an extraordinarily brilliant person is on this stage with me. Alenka is from Ljubljana. She's a Slovenian psychoanalytic theorist and philosopher. She teaches at the European Graduate School, where she's a visiting professor, and at the Institute of Philosophy at the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts in Ljubljana. Now, together with Slavo Žižek and Mladen Dolar, she's one of the most prominent members of what is known as the Ljubljana School of Psychoanalysis. And they follow a particular kind or particular philosophy which was really promoted and I think possibly even started by Jacques Lacan, but you're a Lacanian philosopher, I think, and psychoanalyst, is that right? In the Lacanian tradition.
Of psychoanalysis, but also combined then with philosophy, because Lacan was primarily a psychoanalyst.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the difference between philosophy and psychoanalysis is incredibly important. I hope we get onto that as well. Now, Alenka's also written very widely. She's published very widely. She also delivers amazing lectures, and you can see many of them on YouTube as well. So, yes, you have a feast in store for you. Now, just a couple of titles of books that she's written. One is called The Shortest Shadow, because you write a lot about Nietzsche, I think. Nietzsche is one of your great specialisms. It's called The Philosophy of the Two. But the book we're going to be talking about is about the odd one. So we've gone from 2 to 1 with comedy. And this one's called The Odd One on Comedy. The odd one in. Yeah. The odd one in. And we'll find out what that means as well. Now, you write very widely on all kinds of topics. It's not just about comedy, but this is a really important issue for us here tonight. You write about ethics and literature and the interface between philosophy and psychology and culture. And you write about sex and love and Immanuel Kant and all kinds of amazing Hegel, Henry Bergson and Alain Badiou. So we have a lot of reference points here, I think. Now, before we go back into history and look at Freud and the theories of comedy and so on, you and I were both thinking about Ukraine, as we all do, and I remember just a couple of months after the war started in Ukraine, reading in one of the papers in Great Britain that the comedy clubs had started up in the cellars in Lviv and Kiev, and I thought that was such an amazing form of resistance, if you like, or of release of pressure. And I wondered, what did you think about that when that happened? Did you think that's a kind of normal situation in a situation of war like that? Were you surprised, or?
No, but before I go into this, I just would like really to thank for this opportunity. I'm really, really flattered and honored to be part of this literature day as philosopher, but nevertheless, and to have the privilege to be interrogated by you, of all people who...
Interrogated? Well,
I choose this word on purpose to start the comedy of the thing. So it's really a great pleasure and honor to be here. So yes, I think this is a very good point to start with, because I think comedy is really not only, I would not even say just that it is important in the times of crises, it even flourishes in the times of crisis. Comedy is part of crises, I would say, to some extent. And it's not only, although obviously this also plays a part, it's not only to get some kind of relief and divertisement and so on, opposed to all the hardship, but I think it has at least, probably more, but at least two extremely important functions. First is that it keeps us also, when we are the victims of an invasion or whatever hardship there is, it keeps us alive as subjectivities, as subjects, and prevents for us to be reduced to just this victimized, suffering flesh or whatever who is. So there is a certain power that comes with the ability also to joke about it, to say it's not to this power is not to be underestimated, and it's not a bad power. We almost always nowadays speak of power as something bad that we need to, but there is something empowering about this, which is precisely the refusal to be just the victim. Obviously, they are victims, but precisely as victims, they also want to affirm themselves as subjectivities, as subjects, and not otherwise we end in this paternalistic manner in which very often also refugees are welcome to other countries as far as they remain this kind of silent victims to which horrible things happen. But the moment that they start to speak, to create, to be subject, they are no longer suffering enough, or people lose their sympathy with refugees, or they just go back. I remember from the times of when there were lots of Bosnian refugees in Slovenia during the Yugoslav war, there were often these remarks about Bosnian women. Okay, obviously they came here, we welcomed them, but if one of them appeared with some kind of jewelry, not something expensive, but just to kind of dress up a little bit, and so it's immediately, okay, this does not fit well with the image of the victim. They should be just suffering, and we will love them as victims, but the moment they become some kind of a subjectivity, we can no longer really love them and sympathize so much. So, okay, sorry, this was a long digression, but I think, so one thing is this, and the other, which I guess really happens also when it comes to this underground or whatever clubs, comedy clubs and so on, it's that comedy is also about forming a certain collective. It's something is created there, and this collectivity, even if it's just about the jokes and everything, has a certain political dimension to it. Not explicitly so necessarily, but just the sheer existence of a collective and a kind of collective resistance to things that are...
The actual comedy that is being expressed and performed, it's sometimes, well, it's very often very dark. What we call sort of gallows humor, Galgenhumor in German. And of course, you know, that's got a history across the First World War, Second World War, as far back as we can remember. That's always been the case. But why is it so dark and so intense? Something happens to comedy in war and crisis situations. It changes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the circumstances changes, although there is black comedy around, usually also in times which are not necessarily the times of crisis. It has a certain tradition, let's say, also in other times. But obviously there is something here, I mean, in times of crisis, what usually happens is that there is a lot of dying around or suffering and different kind of injustices, and simply this kind of oppressive feeling that everything is kind of, the world is closing up on us. So there is certain darkness that is all around us in the air. And I think dark comedy is precisely something which uses this darkness to bring in some light, but it can only work with the darkness which is there. It's not that it just ignores this. It works with all these dark elements in order to share some light in this darkness and to perhaps crack up certain perspectives that are not necessarily there if we are just overwhelmed by the sheer whatever atrocity of it.
When you look at the theories of comedy, or the philosophy of comedy, which, you know, to some people might seem a rather paradoxical or strange, strange discipline, but there are, from what I can see, there are three kinds of comedy which are discussed across the ages and in philosophy. One is superiority, the other is incongruity, I think, and the third is relief. So in these crisis situations, it's not the superiority, is it? It's the relief aspect of it. It's getting rid of the stress. There's a kind of energy that comes from just, you know, laughing.
Yes, but I think it's also getting rid of the stress while at the same time mobilizing the stress in a way which allows us precisely to reflect on a situation, perhaps in a way that we would not be able to when we are just overwhelmed by the stress. So it's not simply that, I think at least it could also be just like forget about everything, but it's the way humor works in these situations is not simply a relief. I mean, this is very interesting, the whole story of relief and comedy. Just as a bracket, I will tell you a very funny anecdote. Ernst Lubitsch, the famous director, who actually made a movie, To Be or Not to Be, about Hitler and Polish resistance. It's really something to be we could.
This is a great story.
It's a great, and it's really precisely. And he was criticized at that time. How can you take this lightly? What is this? But in America, the movie was very badly received. But in Europe, which was already in war and everything, everybody, I mean, people really liked it because when they were able to see it, of course. But anyway, what I wanted to say is that he has this very interesting line, because it was very popular in Hollywood of that time to make, to make tragedies with a comic relief, and then comedies with a tragic or sentimental relief. This was the formula. And he said in one of the interviews, you know, I make comedy, I don't want people to get relief of anything. I don't want to relieve them of comedy. You know? So there is this kind of interesting, what exactly is this relief and how it does not necessarily, it can have like we say, sometimes, we are told stress can be positive in the sense that kind of it wakes us up in a good way if we can then use this energy in a certain way. If we don't, it's just terrible. And I guess perhaps comedy has a way of help us work with distress in a way that does not simply make us forget or turn away from what we are dealing, but to get just far enough to be really able to focus on it. Because it's not simply an escape. I think it's a certain internal distance that is needed precisely if we are to continue to think about this hardship. Otherwise, it's just too overwhelming.
Where I come from, in Britain, you could say we're in crisis, constant crisis. We also pride ourselves on our British sense of humour. And I think different cultures, of course, pride themselves on a better or worse sense of humour. And one of the areas of humour which is very rich for us is the Second World War. Dad's Army, and of course, we invented Charlie Chaplin, and we have, I think, a very, a wonderful tradition of humour and comedy, but it's also a very strange, very British trait. And I wondered what you thought about the different national stereotypes of humour, because, for instance, in Britain, we are permitted, if you like, to make jokes. We call them jokes, comedy about the Second World War. And if anybody's ever seen Dad's Army or any of those shows, you'll know what I mean. But in Germany or Austria, you couldn't make those jokes. They wouldn't be accepted.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've grown up with Monty Python, among other things, yeah. So it's obviously British humor was also, I mean, it was an international thing to begin with. So, I understand that there is a kind of different situation in Germany, and particularly in Germany, I guess the part of the Europe where I come from, we never had this kind of verbot, although there were this kind of reverse jokes, I just remember there were these jokes about just after the war, the Second World War, and like when the country opened up, and there were usually like really tons of German tourists coming to the seaside, to Croatian seaside, and so people from Yugoslavia who were not so perhaps so well off or whatever, they said, but you know what are you, the joke was like this, one asks the other, but what do you do in your free time in the summer? So, and the other replies, well, we play this game of Germans, occupators, and partisans. So how do you play this game? It's really easy. You just go climb in the woods up from the main Magistrala, Jadranska Magistrala street, and you watch the Germans drive by, like this kind of, just do the same thing as you did. Then it was German tanks, and now it's
that proves my point.
No, but it was, but this, at the same time, what I wanted to say, this was in, at least at that time when I heard this joke, not at all a kind of resentment joke against Germans. I think this kind of traumas were...
That's the kind of superiority.
It was really the kind of just, it's a funny, it's a similar situation, although the positions and the whatever roles that we had are kind of very different, yeah.
Well, I suppose, some countries feel superior, back to that idea of superiority to others. And
I think their problem.
That's their problem. I think basically in Britain we just think we're inferior. So, maybe it's a kind of reverse humour. But it also reminds me of, the time under communism and socialism as well. And we in the West always assumed that nobody in the East had a sense of humour or had anything to laugh at. We even thought that our own sense of humour in the West was superior, because we just didn't know, we didn't even think there was anything to laugh at in communism. But that's, we've learnt our lesson. There was a lot going on in comedy.
We were already talking before about the propaganda. I mean, there were obviously there is also the Western propaganda, which was to some extent, because there was this fear in the air during the Cold War that perhaps people would nevertheless be tempted to, I mean, people in the West be tempted to somehow say that it's not so bad in the East. So I guess there were lots of these kind of myths that were invented precisely to say how these people can not do anything, not even laugh, or what.
Because if you
laugh, ability to laugh, but okay, the whole situation. Obviously, there were lots of really great jokes. But there was also a way in which, at least I was told, so jokes, particularly jokes about the nomenclatura, were actually produced by this same nomenclatura in order to kind of strategically pacify, perhaps, people. So these jokes against the regime were not even the funniest ones. They were part of the game in which we were supposed to feel that at home we can have this distance to the whatever official regime, and of course this distance that you feel at home without ever being able of publicly declare it, it's the very glue of your following and being part of the regime. So it's this internal distance. It's not necessarily subversive in the sense of, but it's precisely something that you need in order to feel that you are actually different from what you say or do publicly. But this is a trap, or can be a trap, because obviously it is what you do or say publicly that finally matters and makes a difference. But apart from this, there were much more subversive jokes and that were around, and humor and so on. So it's obviously not something that were...
Do you think that your interest in the philosophy of comedy came from that time, from growing up in, under socialism?
I sincerely don't think so. I mean, obviously, when I started writing on this and thinking about it, there were lots of things that I could use or remember from that time as well. But actually, it's a very funny way in which I started to talk about, to think about comedy. What really give the push for me, it's something that had nothing to do with comedy to begin with, but I was listening, I think it was a lecture or a text by Alain Badiou, you mentioned him, who was talking about how art, and particularly literature, but art depicts love. And novels and so on. And his thesis was that art is great in two ways. It talks about love as something, I mean, in the temporality of all the obstacles that need to be overcome in order to then finally unite and live happily ever after. So it's the foreplay, the coming together of love and so on, or it is this kind of amour passion, this passion, to meet, and the love is there, and then there is this kind of a gradual dissolution of love, destruction, everything that is kind of falling apart. And that actually art has no way of, I mean, no way, just very rarely has a way of thinking or talking about love as in its temporality, not as eternal, but as the love that lasts for a while at least. And my immediate reflection was, well, comedy does this precisely. Mm-hmm. It is about temporality of love as this kind of pas de deux, which is not to say, I mean, comedy, all this back and forth that takes place, misunderstandings, this kind of misfirings that nevertheless produce something that can be used then by both or all parties to continue to have fun, so to say, and not only in this divertisement sense, but to precisely pick up what emerges in this space and then use it in further, whatever, as a further element of the play, of the bond, and which is not, and just to add one more theoretical element to this, you know, that Lacan has this famous saying, there is no sexual relationship, which, okay, one obviously doesn't mean that there are no relationships, but that there is no pre-established formula that would be there for something like human relations. And I have this formula that actually love and comedy is precisely a non-relationship that lasts, that goes on for a while. So it's not that everything fits and all is just, you know, this is fusion into one. This has nothing to do with love, which is always a kind of
changing movement.
Yeah, and it involves two, well, usually two, and the very movement that is created in this interaction. And what is also for me very interesting and relates love to comedy is the way in which, for me, what is interesting in comedy, it's not so much about failure or people falling down on or not fulfilling this or that. Obviously, there are all these mishaps, but what really drives comedy is, I think, on the contrary, some surprising surplus realization, some surprising surplus enjoyment, something that happens, you don't even expect it, and then it's there, it's a kind of a miraculous, even almost a gift, and then the whole play is how to now incorporate this into this. You didn't ask for it, now it's there. What do you do with this? So in this sense, so this was a long digression. Actually, I was thinking about love when I started to think about comedy. And the whole, whatever, philosophy and
you know, what amuses me is that you've also concluded that philosophers and comedians are actually very similar. Because philosophers are trying to communicate, and comedians are also doing this pas de deux, as you call it, as well. And you know, you have to do the same thing. You have to. I think it's Bertrand Russell who emphasized that idea of the simplicity of philosophy, and comedy. Good comedy is very simple. You have to start with a setup, and then you have a punchline at the end, which is often very different from what you're going to start with, because you've explored something in that time.
Yeah, and it usually surprises you. This is part of what comic effect comes from, but it is also something that very often, I mean, particularly with jokes which are slightly different from this comic movement, but because there is this temporality which is final. The punchline is the finality of joke. Without it, the joke does not really function. And the comic movement can be slightly different. But the punchline very often is an extremely economic way of saying something, which I think we as philosophers should really look up to, because it's you do look for, I mean, obviously I'm not saying we should just talk in punchlines, but still there are ways in which one can really say something concisely with a few words which are much more telling than like long essays or whatever.
And it's about language as well, the use of language.
It is this, but on the other hand, it is true also that there is this connection between comedy and philosophy that I like, you know, in some more serious, self-important, let's say, circles, you always have, they are both victim of the same kind of saying, which is sometimes people say, okay, stop that comedy, get serious and get to work or whatever. This is just, and something similar people say with about philosophy. Just stop philosophizing and start doing something, you know, serious and important and so on. So there is this kind of idea that there is something almost like not only useless, but useless gratuitous that is about it. But this is precisely, I think, where the emancipatory power of both and interesting and also political power of both comes, because they are not so easily directly put into the service or this or that, of this or that.
What is intriguing for me as well is how few philosophers of comedy there are, because it is so fascinating to hear you talk like this. And if you look back in history as well, philosophers on the whole have been pretty negative on humor. And I mean, you in your writing, you go right back to Plato and Aristotle and so on. And there's also discussion of Freud. And you look at the whole history of the philosophy of comedy. Why do you think philosophers were so negative about humor? Why weren't they engaging with it? Why didn't Plato like comedy?
Well, Plato is a very interesting story because he also hated poetry and so on, but at the same time, I mean, he would, famously send the poets out of the city. But it is also, I think, Giorgio Agamben had this remark in, I think it's in The Man Without Quality. Anyway, how actually, if you look at the history of modern art, how of art in general, but then of modern art, how very often now people even look with some kind of almost nostalgia to the old times when actually poetry or comedy or whatever was taken seriously enough for the poets to be expelled from the city, because at least within what we used to call the flourishing liberal democracy of the West, this was, I mean, you can say or do or whatever you didn't, it had no power to arise this kind of to even achieve this kind of resonance, social resonance. So there is a double edge to this artistic freedom that came with modernity, and it's a good thing, unquestionably, but there is also, in a way, that art, and I think Hegel makes this point, that once it was completely liberated precisely of all these constraints of religion, politics, and so on, conveying this kind of representing the community as a whole in different ways, once it's been freed of that, it also lost some of its social relevance, in the sense that people not like that now everybody would look to art to learn about it. It's just so with Plato it's very interesting to say to what extent he believed, and it's similar, with his idea of mimesis, imitation of. This is why he also sent painters out of the Republic, because they were imitating the ideas which were real. But then Lacan had this very interesting commentary on this, that actually Plato's fear came from the fact that this imitation were not simply imitating the ideas, but they were competing with the ideas. They were themselves ideas, and this is where the revolt, the fear, the severity of the ban can come from, when you actually believe, and this was also the case just shortly before Yugoslavia fell apart and the change of regime, that how it was quite incredible to what extent words were taken seriously. I mean, just stupid jokes and remarks could, shatter up and immediately trigger some kind of meeting of I mean, now you can say whatever you want, nobody really cares. But
it's interesting. One of the first, because I travelled a lot in Eastern Europe as it was then with the BBC, and one of the first places I visited was a place in Bulgaria, in a city called Gabrovo, and they had a house of humour and satire. Mm-hmm. And it was actually started by Todor Zhivkov, and it was very unfunny. But it still exists, so that's definitely changed with the times. And I think what's interesting too is we haven't mentioned the word censorship, of course. And I think censorship, from what you write and what I've been reading, is it creates even an even greater desire to be funny, because you're forbidden, so you have to compete against it.
Yeah, this is one dimension, the imperative to be funny, to beat it, but also, I mean, this was one of, you mentioned Freud before, one of Freud's basic insights, that actually censorship always exists within humor. This is precisely, I mean, censorship, humor has always been, even if you don't have some kind of totalitarian regime around, but we do internalize certain prohibitions, we live in a social way which is normal. There are certain things that we are supposed to not say or not do and so on. And so there is a whole play on this censorship, which can also come from within, from the way we are brought up, from the way our society functions, without necessarily this kind of extremely repressive prolongation of it. So the working with the censorship and how to outsmart it, and how not simply transgress it, but actually precisely outsmart it in the way that you say the same thing that is prohibited by the censorship, but you say it in a way that nevertheless can kind of pass. And
you won't get shot, which is a serious...
So it's an interesting game, if you want. It's an interesting challenge, and obviously the more resourceful you are in doing this, and the more of this kind of repressed material, let's say, you can put into words in a way which no longer subscribes to this censorship that you have interiorized, the more it can be came across as whatever, hilarious jokes and so on. So, but it's interesting because obviously we need this kind of censorships. I'm not saying this is part of culture. It's not something that one can simply eliminate and say, okay, now we'll abolish all censorship. We have all this kind of not necessarily repressive, but still censorship going on. But still, comedy and joking, I guess, it's a very interesting way of shifting, negotiating this, of thinking twice about certain things, moving the space and the way in which this censorship function.
We both have spoken about Freud. Now, this is something I learned again from reading your book, because you do work on that interface between psychoanalysis and philosophy. Yeah. And Freud, too, did much more than people give him credit for. He was a philosopher in his way as well. But the book that I learned, I didn't even know that Freud had written this book. It's called Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious. Now, you, of course, knew about this, but this is an extraordinary revelation for me that Freud that he wrote a whole book about jokes.
No, he actually took very seriously precisely the kind of things that were frowned upon also by philosophers of the time. I mean, I think he would make his point of emphasizing that he was not a philosopher. So I kind of, I mean, I know that he liked to quote this Heine, I think it's Heine's verses, where philosophers are depicted as people in these home ropes, you know, who then fill all the cracks in the universe with the pieces of the ropes, you know, like to make the universe look consistent and homogeneous and so on. And I guess he saw himself as someone who kind of does the opposite, shows the cracks in this homogeneous universe. I don't think that this is the correct depiction of philosophy. I think at least but not only contemporary philosophy is something very different from this kind of Weltanschauung of whatever this or that totality. But still, so Freud was actually taking very seriously the kind of things that people would not take seriously, like slips of the tongue, which is like not simply, you know, to say that, okay, there is some sexual innuendo behind everything. I mean, this is, again, another important lesson I think that one should learn with Freud, that his idea was not that everything can be reduced to sexuality, or the sex is the ultimate answer to everything. The point was that sexuality was a question, that it was actually the question, that nobody knew what it was, that this is where all this kind of interest.
I think that's where Woody Allen's humor comes from,
yeah,
too.
precisely. It's not that it's somewhere and it's there, we just don't talk about it. It's on the surface, it's precisely in the way how we talk about it, and it doesn't know itself what it is. So it's not that there is some ultimate sexual whatever satisfaction that is the answer to everything, because there is no such thing. But anyway, we can have another discussion about sexuality.
May we have another few hours, please? And there's also another interesting juxtaposition, and this is something I came across in a survey I was looking at. In 2014, Oxford University published a survey that they had conducted over a couple of years in Australia, the UK, and the US. And this survey, they had questioned 560 comedians about their motive for doing comedy and what kind of people they were. And I actually wrote down the results of the study, which are very, very, this is obviously very reduced, but comedians have a remarkable amount in common with people with manic depression and schizophrenia. And I wondered what you thought about that particular observation and result of that survey.
Yeah, it just came to me that perhaps this is another thing that comedians share with philosophers. I mean, there is a certain amount of, I mean, it is a bit...
you mean all philosophers are crazy?
I mean, this comes across as like, I mean, we are all crazy in some way, but it's just, there is a certain kind of, perhaps you could call it this way, tearing with the madness or something which is there at a certain edge of something, and works with this edge, and does not simply recede from madness as just like in a kind of way that would modality, like I don't want to know anything about it. So I guess there is something about also taking, now if I return to your question, and the comedians taking certain kind of risks, because it's also, I mean, very often when you are on stage, I guess, as a comedian, you do risk some things, and you are really completely vulnerable to the audience. Although you are there, you have supposedly the power to guide them, but still, if the joke falls flat,
or you fall flat,
then it's really a problem. And now there is this, I guess, there is this moment when one asks, do I now kind of even rise the stakes and try to remake the same joke in an even better way, or not, or I just kind of let it go and try something else? I mean, there is all this art of doing something, and in the way of responding also to these moments of crises that can occur while you perform or while you do something, which are integral part of your whatever humor and how you go about it. So it's surely important. But I don't sure we have time, because
we're fine.
Just because when you mentioned Freud, I then switched to this question of sexuality. But one really important thing about why Freud was so interested both in jokes and slips of the tongue, in dreams, not as some messengers of some whatever beyond, but precisely he saw them as rebuses, you know, that you should listen to the narrative of the dream, just to the words and how they combine, and how they, what sense do they make, even though they seem to the dreamer as completely nonsensical. Not sense like a deeper sense, but precisely how when you talk about them, you narrate something and you don't even hear what you are saying. It makes certain sense. So, and I think this is also what then, okay, obviously Lacan picked up, it's that Freud saw the enormous creativity or the importance of language in all this, and also in the very existence of the unconscious. This all happens through language. It doesn't, even if you cannot say the word, it's repressed, whatever, to put it very simply, but you do say it anyway. And so this way in which language always plays or is part of this, at least two scenes, two different dimensions, is very important. And it's this idea that the unconscious is out there on the surface. You just listen carefully what people say, how they behave, and this is what is the unconscious, not some deeply hidden realm of divinity.
And comedy is about bringing out that
comedy is precisely also about this kind of surfaces. This is why it was often kind of despised as being superficial, but I think a very philosophically important point of comedy is precisely don't mock, don't think that superficial things, the things that are there on the surface are just trivial by this very fact that they're on the surface. Sometimes they're much more profound and tell you much more about what is going on behind than simply some kind of profound wisdoms, you know, that pronounced with huge solemnity and so on. So there is this attentiveness to what is being said, how it is being said, and through this to kind of bring into play everything else that is not being said.
Thank you for the moment. I've got a few more questions, but let's hear from Veronika.
Well, thank you. Thanks. First of all, I would like to encourage the audience here to feel free and ask questions a bit later. Online, we got 3 questions, which I think we can put 2 of them into one, and I best tell you both of them now. Yeah. The first one would be the question whether humor is a universal phenomenon, or if there are maybe regions in the world where you find people who specifically lack a sense of humor.
Yes.
And the 2 questions that go together would be whether you consider humor a question of intelligence, and is there anything that people who lack any sense of humor have in common?
I didn't catch the last bit, sorry.
People who don't show humor, who don't have a sense of humor, if they have anything in common.
Well, I think we've got 3 questions in one there. So is humor universal? Is humor also a matter of intelligence? And what about those people who don't show or have a sense of humor? Do they have something in common?
Yeah, I mean, I would answer this from within the world, you know. I'm not like making some kind of panoramic overview of the world, but the places that I've visited so far, from this experience, I can say that it seems universal. It doesn't. I mean, I don't think I've ever visited a country where this humor would not exist or not, but okay, I have not visited every country in the world. So,
but I think let's invite everybody on the live stream, whichever country they're in.
No, I think, but obviously there are different cultures, and also the position of humor in different cultures is different. It's not, I mean, the way we look at it here, let's say in the West, or it's probably very different from the situation in which people from some other parts, perhaps, or some other cultures, which have also perhaps different things that replace humor in this role that I was depicting before. But definitely, I think there is, so there are differences, and there is also this saying, you know, that you can really enjoy the joke only if you are part of the same parish, you know, which again kind of puts this universalism in a bit of course it's universal, but at the same time it's also could be at least a little bit not necessarily sectarian, but if you don't share the same cultural background, then lots of jokes are simply lost on you, not that
but is it a matter of intelligence? Is it a matter of intelligence?
well, I definitely think that there is something about humor in general, or comedy or jokes, which is very much related to, let's say, the intellectual part of our brain, or the part, you know, there is this saying that the world is the tragedy to those who feel and the comedy for those who think. So obviously we are both, we feel and we think, but still something is there in this remark saying that there is a certain intellectualization, so called, that kind of takes place within the very procedure of humor. Not because we are more intelligent when we do it, but we use precisely a certain way of putting things together, which is not directly kind of emotional, although it has a certain Verfremdungseffekt, to use the Brechtian.
The alienation effect.
So it does, yeah, so in this sense it can have this kind of intellectual, but it does not mode in it, which is thinking about something in a certain way, perhaps in a different and more bizarre way that you would do normally, or people do normally, again back to the schizophrenia.
Yes, no, absolutely.
So making certain connections that are not obvious, but then when they are made, all of a sudden everybody, or at least members of the same parish, recognize this obvious, this is so, but you don't think of it before this connection is made. So this is a very powerful, I guess, way of transmitting certain truths, which is more akin, or it's akin to a certain kind of, this certain kind of intelligence. Yeah.
Any questions from the audience? I've got a few more, if...
Yeah, I also don't see well.
So I'll just ask a few final questions, if I may, of you. And you knew that I was bound to ask this, but as a philosopher of comedy, do people always say, oh, you know, tell us a joke? They assume that you must have lots of jokes. Now, this book, I've got to say, it's not very funny. It's on comedy. It's about the odd one in. So tell me who is the odd one in, and then tell me some of your favorite jokes.
Yeah, no, it's good that you asked about the title. It's a kind of intranslatable title, which is why the German version is just called The Geist der Komödie, because this is a play on this game, you know, when you put the odd one out. You know, there is this, whatever, I guess it was...
The odd one out is the outsider.
Yeah. It's, and you have to recognize, usually you are asked to see a number of elements, and you have to recognize the one that does not belong in this series and say this one needs to go out. And this was the play on this, saying that what comedy does is precisely to take the odd one and brings it in. And this is how comedy kind of starts. And I really like this. I mean, I have another example in the book of slightly different modalities in which what we usually call irony works and how comedy works. Okay, I won't go into, there are different kinds of irony, but let's say like just two techniques. One is, the first example is this famous graffiti, you probably know about it, which says first, God is dead, Nietzsche, and then below, Nietzsche is dead, God. So this is this kind of, you know...
one of my favorite jokes.
Being more clever, okay, you kind of point at the limit of the enunciation of the previous, so, and you're cleverer than the previous one. But I think, for me, like differently from this, the proper comic modality is precisely when this, instead of accepting your view on the situation and positing yourself in this superior position, you kind of include yourself in. And the version of this joke, the same joke would be, God is dead, and I'm not feeling too well either. It's the same kind of whatever, it is joke, but it's precisely, you know, this kind of leveling. I think this is a very, very important movement of comedy, which does not go by this exempting. And there is also a very interesting observation made by Harvey, the theory, he wrote on comedy and film comedy a lot. And he says that, like, differently from irony, again, in a certain sense of irony, which only grows more efficient and powerful if half of the audience doesn't get it. You know, the comedy, if the joke doesn't, it falls flat, it's the end. So there is this kind of, there are certain genres also of funniness, of comedy, where you simply fall flat if your joke does not go through, if it doesn't produce this kind of more or less collective that can read it, that recognize themselves in this, which also can have its backsides, but there is this production of a certain we there, as opposed to this moment when the more you see how some of the others didn't get the joke, the more the joke works for you, because you can also. Yeah. This is the title. So the idea is simply, and you mentioned Charlie Chaplin. I mean, what he does is basically this. You know, if you remember the opening scene of City Lights, I mean, this is one of the best movies. It's when there is this in the city, there is this statue of peace and prosperity and peace, and there is this solemn opening, or how do you say, of the statue. So they put this blanket off it, so peace and prosperity, this music and the marriage there and everyone. And then there is this tramp, Charlie Chaplin, sleeping in the lap of prosperity, you know, the statue of prosperity. And then he's just embarrassed, obviously, there, and he starts to climb down, and then his trousers get caught into some sword, and I mean, it's the whole surplus, which is part of the picture, even if we don't want for it to be, but at the same time, in the sense that makes the whole thing move, and to not simply to kind of really produce something not only funny but interesting in this sense of.
Sort of unlike a lot of comedy, because there's so much comedy today. There's so much on television and film and so on too, and a lot of it is not funny because it's tailored. It's very, very sharply tailored. I mean, I think we've actually got to finish, unfortunately.
No, I'm sorry.
But still, no, me too. But so which is the joke you would tell at a dinner party? What's your favorite joke?
I don't know. No, really, this depends on the dinner party, on the context, on what is said. But
spoken like a true philosopher.
No, but I really think, because jokes are also told in a certain social context. So if we were discussing some things, I mean, you think of jokes in the context of discussions. But if you want one joke, I mean, for me, jokes are also, as I said before, are very important ways of economically making a point that otherwise would need to be explained in number of pages. And one of the jokes, and probably people who have read my stuff will know it very well, because I keep repeating it, I'm not the only one, which also for me conveys a very interesting philosophical thinking about negativity as something which is not simply negative or absent, but has its own material existence and effects. It's a joke that actually comes from Lubitsch's Ninochka, but it's already there told as a joke, and it goes like this. A person comes to this cafe, and they say, "Oh, waiter, can I please have coffee without cream?" And the waiter comes back and says, "Sorry, sir, but we are out of cream. Could it be without milk?" So this is one joke that I use a lot. So I'm not saying that I would use it at every dinner party, but it definitely helped me conceptualize and think about certain dimension of negativity and what is not there. So coffee without cream is not exactly the same as coffee without milk. And
well done. We got there. But what is so fantastic for me and phenomenal is your extraordinary knowledge of the whole of comedy, I think, from Plato onwards too. I mean, and also all the films you must have watched, all the TV shows you must have watched in order to research your work. work. It's really, really
No, this
extraordinary.
just, I didn't even do it just to do the, I mean, this was part of my
Part of your life.
passion of,
yes.
or whatever, yeah, I like
Well,
to watch these movies.
You've
so-
made it into an amazing profession, and we're incredibly grateful. It's been really wonderful having your company tonight, and I think it's set us all up very, very well for the next few days. So thank you, Alenka Zupančič, very much indeed.
Thank
Great
you,
to-
and thank you for the...
Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank an Natalka Sniadanko, Alenka Zupančič, Katja Gasser und Rosie Goldsmith, und Ihnen vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Ich möchte Sie noch hinweisen auf unsere täglichen Blogs, die Sie ab morgen auf der Website der Europäischen Literaturtage nachlesen können. Es sind so Tagebucheintragungen zu den Lesungen und Dialogen von Viktoria Strobel und Irene Zanol. Hinweisen möchte ich Sie auch auf die, wie ich finde, wunderschön künstlerisch gestalteten 3 Minuten Videobuchbesprechungen, die nun nach und nach zu Büchern der Europäischen Literaturtage auf die YouTube-Seite von Elit hochgeladen werden. Diese kleinen Videos werden gestaltet von Bert Matzenauer, Anna Lux, Peter Volkert und Gina Bucher. Morgen geht es weiter um 9:30 Uhr, wie ein böser Traum, Yara Nakahanda Monteiro und Ivana Saiko. Moderation Rainer Moritz. Ich wünsche Ihnen noch einen schönen Abend. Vielen Dank für Ihr Kommen.
Thank you.